Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. Today's episode is in association with Juggernaut Books. In one of the most interesting reads of this year, I recently happened to read an advanced copy of a translation of Blood by Sunil Gangopadhyay. Sunil Gangopadhyay, if some of you aren't aware, is one of Bengal's best loved and most acclaimed writers. He even won the Sahitya Academy Award for his novel Those Days in 1980s. Recently, Dr. Debali Mookerjea-Leonard, the professor of English and World Literature at James Madison University, decided to translate one of his beloved works, Rokta, into English, titled Blood. The book releases this Friday on 22nd May. So today we have with us Dr. Mukherjee talking about the translation process and her experience while working with multiple languages and translating one of the greatest pieces of Bengali literature. Without any further ado, here we go.
Hi, Debali. Before we start with any other questions, just a very quick introduction for all our listeners and not the one that appears on blurbs of the books, something that tells us just a slightly more about you.
Okay. Um, the book was actually, when I first read it in Calcutta, it was because my mother had checked it out of the library and
Okay.
she insisted that I read the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a student of comparative literature at Jadavpur University. And so I was reading a lot of world literature anyway. But I had not read this book. I had read other novels by Sunil Gangopadhyay, like Shei Shumoy or Those Days,
Mm-hmm.
which is set sort of in the 19th and 20th centuries. And at that time, a few years actually before that, his novel Purva Poshchim or East West had just been serialized.
Okay.
And I was intrigued by them. But I have to say that Rokto, Blood,
Mm-hmm.
the novel that I would eventually translate, moved me in a whole different way. Um, I mean, the character Topon, he's so tortured, but he's a complex character, but he certainly has his flaws, and I liked that because typically the hero turns out to be someone good, generous, compassionate, etc. But here was
Mm-hmm.
a very different hero, and so that made me want to work on this book.
Right. So, that's really fascinating, and it's great that you brought up how I apologize for calling him Tapan instead of the slightly Bengali pronunciation
Oh,
of
that's
Tapan.
fine. Oh, please
That's
don't worry
something.
about that.
Right. But that was something that I personally felt while reading the book is that uh, Tapan's character is, apart from being a very complex character, agreed, but it's also a very realistic character. You do
Hmm.
see people like it, right? Because I have noticed that often in fiction have you tend to veer away from the gray, either towards a blacker side of the character or a whiter side, right? And paint them in those tones. But
Uh-huh.
here we had Tapan reflected for majorly his flaws. Like the larger plot of the book revolves around Tapan's flaws leading to a sort of self-discovery, right? And that's something that I wanted to ask you about. As something I personally felt while reading was that Tapan's behavior and his actions were very, I know, reeked of certain patriarchal notions, which in a sense is something that was reflected in, say, the character Gangopadhyay was painting. But then, as a female translator, did you ever feel that uh, either a uncomfortable while translating or like while trying to express those derogatory feelings, if I can put it that way, when he literally reaches a stage where he's hitting uh, his partner, right?
Yes. Yes.
Or and even apart from if the the discomfort did creep in, how did you not let it affect your translation? Because at the end of the day, they getting a pitch perfect translation is very difficult from what I understand, and we will discuss that later into the podcast. But yeah, this was something that piqued my curiosity.
Sure. Well, you are absolutely right in talking about Topon's own patriarchal um, the expression of many of his patriarchal views,
Mhm.
which is why the chapter that you just referred to, where Topun returns from his
Mhm.
friend's place after he has been roughed up
Mhm.
by these racist hooligans in London,
Mhm.
and he comes back and then he takes out his rage on his friend.
Right.
Uh, it was actually very difficult for me to handle that section.
Right.
Um, um, but another thing that I also found kind of a little disturbing while doing the translation. So some of the narratorial interventions, for
Mhm.
instance, it says Topon adopts an imperative tone when speaking to women. And
Mhm.
then there's a sentence, and women like that. I wanted to ask the author, like, which women like that?
Mhm.
Whom are you
Mhm.
talking about?
Right.
Um, Instead of making a general claim of that nature,
Mhm.
maybe he could have tempered it a little. Some women might like that.
Right.
But, these absolutes, they bothered me, and they bothered
Okay.
me a lot.
Right.
So I already knew that the narratorial voice, to some degree, had adopted
Mhm.
these ideas, these very patriarchal ideas.
Right.
And so, um, like I said, I agree with you. Many of Topun's views, and or at other points, for instance, when his cousin is to be married. This is
Right.
towards the end of the book. This is chapter
Right.
11, and it says. She looked beautiful. I mean, this is before her marriage, prior to her marriage. She looked beautiful. Women look their best at this time.
Right.
I'm sure, I mean, they're very happy, they're going to get married, etc. But again, I find these absolute claims a little disturbing, a little bothersome. And
Right.
I am bothered by them. Uh, but, uh, but, I also like the way the author um, handles the ending of the book. These
Mhm.
characters, actually, they stayed with me. They
Right.
stayed with me. um, I had conversations with them in my head. I
Right.
advised them and
Mhm.
things like that, and
Right.
I wanted to imagine um, other endings. I wanted
Mhm.
to know about their lives beyond the covers of the novel. This is what drove me. I lived with
Right.
these characters after I
Right.
had read the novel. And I I agree with you what you said about Topun's
Right.
patriarchal views, but I also like the way the novelist handles the problem.
Right.
Because to some degree, Siddharth, I would say that Sunil Gangopadhyay, to some degree, is quite partial to women
Okay.
characters.
Mhm.
So um, I see sort of uh, two sides here, and perhaps the patriarchal views have more to do with Topol.
Mhm. Right. So that's quite interesting because that also kind of leads me to my next question, wherein so something that I also see about Tapan's character in the book is that he somehow wanted to, just break away from who he was as this static person, things that were not chosen by him but yet defined him, his nationality of birth, his skin color, or his culture, right? He mentions he doesn't believe in race, he doesn't want to believe that he's an Indian or stuff like that. And he tries really hard to do that through his journeys to America and London. And something that he realizes through that encounter with the hooligans, I suppose, or how he sees himself through that really violent reaction he has on seeing that picture of his father and his father and Alice's father, is that somehow he isn't able to break past it. Somehow that those static identities are still a part of him, right?
Mhm.
So did you ever, as a person, feel this? Because I feel as a this is something that you might have. Uh, what I personally have felt is that when you're translating, or is that the more you resonate with the book or the characters, the easier it is to kind of translate from one language to the other. But so, what has been your experience in this regard? And did you feel that you could accurately capture what uh, Sunil Gangopadhyay tried to portray in his book?
I think Topon's what drives Topon is the childhood trauma, the trauma of having lost his father and then having to move with his family from place to place.
Right.
And I think that really that that's something that's a driving force within him. And then we find out that he he has always held some kind of animus towards the British,
Right.
except that it goes away when it's probably easier to hate some anonymous mass, but when he meets an individual like his friendship with Ted, that
Mhm.
absolutely contradicts this idea. You no longer see him hating the British, or at least not this British individual.
Right.
And it he spends a lot of time with Ted, and it is upon Ted's request that he comes to London, and he
Right.
spends his time with Ted as much as is possible. Then of course Ted leaves. But I think that there are these contradictions where Topun does not like the British, but then Topun likes this particular British individual. He
Mhm.
even starts seeing a British woman. I don't think that would have happened if he really held an animus towards the British.
Right.
But then again, while he tells his friend Ted, I don't care about history, etc., the photograph somehow sets him off. And
Right.
of course, that has to do with his family. So, in some ways, I can understand these deep family ties. I'm very close to my family.
Right.
Uh, my sisters and my father are all in India.
Mhm.
My mom is no more,
Right.
but my family is all in India, and I can understand these deep family ties. But have I ever encountered the kind of racism that Topon has to face in London with the gang violence, with being beaten up?
Right.
Well, no, I haven't.
Mhm.
But I I sort of tried to imagine the anger that he would feel, because I think that had that episode not happened, he probably wouldn't have been violent later.
Right.
Later when he's back
In
in the
in
hotel,
the
that he
hotel.
wouldn't have
Right.
been
Yes.
so violent. So I believe it is driven by racism. Like I said, I have not encountered that kind of racism in my life, thank God. Uh, but I tried to imagine what it would be like, because these episodes of racism are not rare.
Right.
So I certainly, uh, as I said, I have not. It's not drawn from personal experience, but it's drawn from opening newspapers. In fact,
Right.
in a way.
No, and it's actually quite fascinating when you think about it, that because we've come a long way since, right? Like since when the book
Uh-huh.
was set, in terms of how connected the globe is in general. It's not just about the place of Indians in a Western society, but it just everyone is quite everywhere now, and there is. I'm not to say that racism has completely gone away, but that we are living in a much more integrated globe. So it's and yeah, it's just fascinating when you think about it, that so this is something that comes from my parents. Like we always had these conversations about how there are a lot of religious tensions in India, or a lot of caste based tensions, and a lot of these things go trace back to historical events, something very obvious being the partition, right? The entire animosity between India and Pakistan. A lot of it stems from the partition and the pre-partition violence that surrounds it. And a lot of my discussion with people who are, whose parents suffered through this, like I am of a generation who's the third generation from the partition, third or fourth generation from the partition. But people elder to me, someone who's 15, 20 years elder to me, someone who was born to people who were, affected by partition. And any logical or, human rights based argument ends with, what, we completely get what you mean, but after a point of time, you can't fight that feeling when you've seen someone from your family being massacred. It is very difficult to move past that. I'm not advocating racism. Please don't get me wrong.
Sure.
It's just one of those. Just gives a lot more context to the complex societal understandings around the globe, for that matter. India is just one of those examples that we had partition. Everyone had their own this thing. But Debali, moving away from the book. So your CV mentions that you're quite fluent in a few languages, and you can read German and Spanish. You are quite proficient in French. You can, I think, read Urdu. I think, if I'm not wrong.
I can't read Urdu. I can't read Urdu, but I can understand Urdu very well.
Okay, you can understand Urdu, and Hindi and
I
English.
don't know the Nashtalik script, so I don't. I can read Urdu.
But that's still a lot more than what a lot of people already know. So this love for languages, does this have a root somewhere, or is just something very organic that just defines you as a person?
You see, growing up in India, I think most Indian children, or at least, I don't know, well, I'd say most Indian children happen to be bilingual. Not only there, and I'm talking about people not, whose native tongue is not Hindi. So you know Bengali, and Hindi you always know because you're watching Hindi films.
Right.
So, and if you're fortunate to be born in a sort of, I don't know, middle class family, you go to a good school where you are always trained in English.
Right.
And but more of the love for language developed when I was in college, because as a student of comparative literature, we were taught Tamil, and at the same time, for one of my subsidiary subjects, I took German. So I learned these two languages at that time. Although I have to say that much of the proficiency I may have had at some point in Tamil has actually more or less disappeared by now. But German is different. And then before I came to this country, when I was thinking about my PhD, I thought about working on Indian and Latin American literature. In order to work on Latin American literature, I was actually taking private lessons in Spanish. This is before I came to this country. Wow. And then when I came here, I continued my Spanish lessons. But by then, my interests had also changed. And I wanted to focus not on South Asian and Latin American, but more so on South Asian literature. Okay. But in order to complete the requirements for the PhD in my field at the University of Chicago, it was necessary to learn either German, to be fluent in either German or French. Okay. Which is why I decided at that time I was going to do French. I can't, while I'm saying fluent in French, it means more of proficiency in reading, writing, and understanding, not really proficiency in speaking. But like I said, I can read, write, and understand French, but I cannot speak it.
Right. So this one's going to be a slightly longer question, right? And so one of the books that stood out for me in life was, I'm a huge fan of Jhumpa Lahiri's work, and something she wrote, I think back in 2016, was In Other Words. So it was a book where she decided she just felt that she has an innate love for the Italian language, and she tried learning it in the US, and she didn't quite enjoy the process as much. So she made a bold choice. She just shifted to Italy, learned the language, wrote a book in the language, and then translated back to English. Right? The reason why I bring this up is because given that you've just studied different languages at different levels of proficiencies, of course, but uh, have you ever felt that there are, uh, and given that you have at least one work that I know of yours has been a translation, and I'm sure you have dabbled in it over your career. So my question is that how do you deal with situations where you come across certain words which are absolutely unique to the culture in which the language was developed, right? There are often words which are just so contextual and so ingrained to the geographical domination where the language was born, or like the culture or community which uses it, and capturing that emotion becomes a very difficult process.
Mhm.
So as a translator, how do you go about dealing with it? Because, and especially because when you have to do it for multiple languages, right? Sometimes you might be able to do it from, say, Bengali to English, but maybe not to French, for
Mhm.
example, right?
Um, y- uh, there are certainly words in Bangla that remain untranslatable. First of all, jokes are, of course, it's very difficult to
Yeah,
translate
that's
humor.
right.
But there are other words, and the word that immediately sprung to mind is adda.
Okay.
Addas, I cannot really, you have to know what adda is because it's not just a conversation between friends. It's a
Right,
lot more, but it's a word that I would think is very, very difficult to translate
right,
into another linguistic medium. Um, I have been fortunate in that I have not had to deal with too many of these words.
okay,
But in the process of translating, there have been times when I have spent an entire morning deciding between synonyms, which
right,
which which option captures the nuances best. I've had to
right,
spend a lot of time doing that, and so. It has been very rewarding eventually to come up with something,
mhm,
but another problem that I've had actually is while making English translations are the you know in all Indian languages there are specific words for kinship relations.
yes,
You know, your father's older brother is an uncle, but he has a specific name
big
which is
name,
different
right,
from the word you use for your father's younger brother,
right,
who's also an uncle. In Bengali, like in many, many Indian languages, uh, your father's older brother is Jathamoshai. In English,
right,
he's an uncle.
right,
While your kaka, who's your father's younger brother, is also an uncle.
uncle, right,
And your mother's brother is also uncle. So this is something I found actually very difficult to deal with,
mhm,
which is why I had to. I mean, you typically don't see novels with superscripts and the
right,
explanations and footnotes, but I had to do it because I wanted to distinguish between a Jathamoshai, an uncle
right,
who's the father's older brother,
right,
and a kaka, who's the
right,
father's younger brother. And then there is another character who has a Meshomoshai, and a Meshomoshai is the husband of a Mashi,
mhm,
a
mhm,
maternal aunt.
right,
So this is an uncle by marriage. In English, it's all uncle.
right,
So that's why I had to make use of the footnotes. Typically, I do not like to read novels with footnotes, but I think in this case, in case of a translation,
right,
especially where English lacks these subtle nuances, that it
right.
had to be done by way of a footnote.
Because like I completely get what you mean. I had this on this very podcast a couple of episodes ago. I was talking to an author who quite correctly described English as one of the most limiting languages out there in terms of what can be expressed in the language. Or,
Hmm.
and for that matter, I think it's also a very interesting way of just looking at the cultural differentiation between the roots of the language. to the extent that English, being a more European and a Western language, reflects a lot more about how they perceive families or kinship, as opposed
Yes.
to how, as a whole, the Indian subcontinent or even South Asia in general perceives kinship as a more, it's more specific. You have different dynamics with literally every person in your family, and that's why there is a specific term for kinship. And that's just a
Yeah.
very interesting thing for me to, and that's why I actually enjoy books where, at least if the translator or if it's an original book, they try and capture this kinship term by using the original rather than reverting to the usual English uncle aunt. And that just kind of adds
Yeah.
more context to the book and where the character's coming from and how the equation goes between the two of them.
Absolutely.
Right. So, Dibali, growing up, what were things that you read? Like, in so throughout your life, I'm sure there have been some, I don't want to use the word favorites, but there would definitely have been books that stood out for you, books that impacted you. I'm sure, like as you mentioned, Rocto was one of them, and it stayed with you, and that it, to the extent that years later, it may, you still wanted to, I don't know, associate with it somehow and translate
Mhm.
it. So maybe not to that extent that you want to translate these works, or not necessarily non-English works, but then books that have made that have driven you through life or have been emotional marking points in your life.
Um, well, you see, I learned to read fairly early. My mother sort of encouraged that, and she bought me plenty of books to read all the time. Um, it was her way of making sure that I behaved, because uh, she loved watching movies, and there was a movie theater very close to where we lived, and she would go there to watch movies in the afternoons, because my father typically did not like watching movies, and he never watched Bengali or Hindi movies. If he watched
Right,
movies, they were typically English movies.
right.
And but this movie theater near our house, it played mostly Bengali and Hindi movies. We had an old my father's widowed aunt lived with us.
Mhm.
My mom didn't want me to bother this elderly lady for during her afternoon naps.
Right.
So she would put me up on the windowsill, hand me a book, and she would, and this is kind of strange, she would draw a line in chalk on the floor and tell me, remember what happened to Sita when she stepped across the line? If you get off that window and go and bother her, you will be severely punished. Sit here, read your book, and I'll get you one this afternoon when I return.
Right,
So every week I received like 2 or 3 books, depending on how
right,
many movies my mom wanted to see. And so that actually almost nurtured a habit of reading.
right.
And then when I was 8 years old, and at this time I was primarily reading Bengali books.
Okay.
Uh, and some English books. Like I was reading actually Tintin, the
Mhm.
Adventures of
Of
Tintin,
course,
those
of
comics.
course.
Uh, but at this time, when I was still very young, my father took a job in Nairobi, Kenya, and so all of us moved there. But moving to Kenya meant that my supply of Bengali books was cut off.
All right.
So now I was reading English books constantly. Enid Blyton, everything by Enid Blyton, I'd finished during our stay in Nairobi. And then we came back. And anyway, I pursued comparative literature, which meant access to some of the finest works of world literature. A
Sure.
book that a book that has moved me like no other is itself actually one that I read in translation. I'm sure it will sound cliched, but it's 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia
Yes,
Marquez.
yes, yes, of course.
And and I loved that book.
Mhm.
I I read it, and then our professor had explained it, and it to this date remains my, well, I think we have many favorites, but it's among the top. And then there are other books like
Right,
Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children.
right.
And then I enjoyed reading the Satanic Verses. I mean,
Right.
about the Satanic Verses, I thought some editor should have taken a very sharp pair of scissors and cut off part of it,
Mm-hmm.
many parts of it. But I did enjoy reading the Satanic Verses.
Right.
The imagination, it's absolutely mind blowing. And of course his Salman Rushdie's The Most Last Sigh. I also
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed reading Shame. I actually really like all of those books on South Asia. The
Right.
first few,
Mm-hmm.
not the first one, but uh, beginning with Midnight's Children um, through The Most Last Sigh, and also Harun.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Harun and the Sea of Stories. But then another book that is very close to my heart is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird.
Okay.
But I interrupted you. You were going to say something,
No,
Siddharth.
no, it's I don't know. It's just I think funny that I think I've read all the books that you just mentioned. Not at least the three books that you primarily mentioned. And I just something that stood out for me in all three of them was something that we spoke about earlier, right? When we were talking about Tapan's character and about how his characters were flawed and how he had certain patriarchal notions to it, and but how the book has to be seen in context. The same way I think goes for Marquez's works. If you read 100 Years of Solitude or Love in the Time of Cholera and you just
Mm-hmm.
take away context from it, it comes across as a very creepy and very condescending book, right? Like think about the things, I think in Love in the Time of Cholera, he ends up romancing even a 14-year-old at a point of time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the same thing goes for 100 Years of Solitude. It's not the best. I mean, I love the book. I absolutely love. I get where you're coming from, and it's something that the same goes for Midnight Children, right? There's a lot of context that goes into it, and it just is very interesting that the best books that people end up reading are not the ones where your characters are, you know, let's say not human, but they are in fact really human. They are the ones
yes,
who you can really relate to in life. That, if I were in this situation, I would probably act out in the exact same way or probably in a
yes,
similar manner, right? And
yes.
I won't be that level headed person who will just, walk away from the situation or be calm about it. Just, this is who I am. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just beautiful how these authors and writers capture like the creativity and the description and how they go into depth and detail describing things. It's just something. Yeah, it's perfectly um, great to hear all of that. Okay. Thank you, Debali, for this. This was my last question for you, and thank you so much for doing this. I wish you all the best for your upcoming book.
Thank you,
And
thank you, Siddharth.
I really wish to read more of your translated work because I haven't read the original, but something that I experienced while. So I mean, this is something that I use as an indicator for a good piece of fiction, and I think I can very fairly just like uh, transpose it onto a translation as well. That um, if a work can transport me to its setting and can make me experience, it can make me experience what the words actually are saying. It
Mm-hmm.
is actually a very well done piece of literature, and that's what Blood was for me. That
Siddharth, thank you very, very much for those kind words. As a translator, I can sincerely wish no other praise than what you have just said. So thank you very much.
I hope all of you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, and if you want more updates from us, please like and comment and subscribe to our channel and our podcast. And don't forget to check out our website kitabikarwan.com and check us out on Instagram at the rate Kitabi Karwan. The links are in the description. We'll be back with more such episodes and more such interesting authors for you.